Good morning and welcome to the latest in the IMAP webinar series. It's a real pleasure for us today to host this series on building a wholesale high net worth and not-for-profit client base. And it's a particular pleasure for me because the participants who've agreed to talk in this series of 3 webinars bring perhaps 250 years of experience between them. So we're very lucky to have 6 presenters and a moderator who between them have considerable experience in developing advice businesses for which these 3 parts of the market are really quite material and important. I'll introduce our moderator, Greg Miller, in a moment, but before I hand over to Greg, let me just say a little about our upcoming events. So Wednesday, we'll be talking about not-for-profits and charities, and on Friday, we'll be talking about the strategic issues around running advice businesses which focus on these markets, and the participants are there on the screen ahead of you. But I wanted to say a little particularly about our May Advisor Roadshow. Advice is going through a serious transformation at this stage. And in IMAP, we've always tried to address those issues which speak to the ways in which advice business and advice practice is most efficiently and most effectively run. You'll see on the screen the topics which we're presenting on. So how to transition to a managed account program, talking about ESG. That was one of the most successful sessions at our recent portfolio management conference. Business models. What are the business models that really work for advice businesses? Why larger advice practices prefer MDA services. And we'll have a number of MDA advisors speaking today, not specifically about MDAs, but that's been part of their approach to wholesale high net worth and not-for-profits. How we give advice and managing the journey to self-licensing. And the presenters for the roadshow are really drawn, as this webinar series is drawn, from really experienced advice businesses. So businesses like LaVista and Matrix, Findex, Shaw and Partners, Jordan Financial, Family Wealth Advisory, AZNGA, as well as Zenith, Lonsec, Evergreen. So a really deep pool of experience to talk about these issues. I'd invite you to register and attend in Brisbane, Melbourne or Sydney. Now, let me just remind you that if you have a question for our moderator today, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Click that, type question, and Greg and the other panelists will see that. Now, Greg Miller will be known to many of you as formerly the Executive General Manager of Advice for MLC. Now, Greg works with a number of licensees that I know are particularly involved in this area. And it was a real pleasure for me when Greg agreed to act as the moderator for this series. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Greg Miller to take us through this week's webinar series. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Toby. Yes, it's great to be here, and I've been looking forward to these subjects and topics for some time, and I think that they will bring a real interest to many of the people viewing through the webinar. So in today's session, we've got a list of erstwhile presenters with Simon Carrodus, Paul Ashworth, David Andrew. David running his own business out of Western Australia, long time advisor, well experienced. Paul Ashworth from Cameron Harrison, and Simon from The Fold Legal. And what we want to try and do today is obviously bring the expertise and knowledge of these particular gentlemen to the fore, but allowing you to ask questions, obviously, if you feel the desire to do so. So I'm just going to double check about Simon being online. Simon, are you there? Simon may not be with us. We've had a little bit of technical difficulty with Simon. That's okay. So I'll come back to some things with the particular questions that I've got for Simon a little later on. What we want to do out of today's session is get a real understanding about high net worth clients, how to deal with them in wholesale, what are some of the legal ramifications that might be faced with that, how some of these people find their high net worth clients and the sort of modes that they use to give advice. So David, I might go to you first and get you to give us a bit of a rundown of what is sort of your ideal client in the high net worth space, how you go about looking after those clients.
Yeah, look, our average client, I guess, across our entire business, 440 families, is about $2.5 million. And obviously there's very, very significant family groups in the mix making up that average. We're a comprehensive wealth management firm, so we don't hold ourselves out just to be the investment management piece. We are really seeking to be a cradle to grave financial advisory firm across generations, if you will. So it's just as important to us to make sure that mum and dad are being properly looked after as it is to ensure that each of the adult children has an appropriate wealth management lifetime plan in place. That's in and of itself a different subject and is sometimes somewhat challenging. We found are you happy for me to just give a bit of a lead, Greg, on how we deal with the whole wholesale?
Yes, please.
At this point, yeah.
Anyway, David.
Yeah. So we've really looked very, very closely at the wholesale rules and how it might work, and we've actually made the decision for all of our wealthy families to remain in the retail advisory space. I guess it came down to something of a risk management decision, Greg, where we've always been in the professional practice program at the FPA. So when the code came in, you sort of think, well, it's different, but it's not that different. It's more onerous, but in the spirit of what it's asking us to do, it's not that different to the FPA professional practice rules. And I guess speaking to people like Simon and others, the advice we've always received is, as advisors, we've got a duty of care to these people anyway. So I know speaking to advisors, a lot of people look at the wholesale rules as a bit of a shortcut. We've not seen it that way. And whilst the advice that we might give to a wealthier client is different to a less wealthier client, it's still going to be in writing. It's still going to be comprehensive. It's still going to be appropriate to the knowledge of the families. And I think, Greg, I'm going to pause on this point, but I think the biggest thing that we've had to come to terms with is a lot of our clients are business owners. And it may be that the primary relationship that we have with the family is absolutely a sophisticated investor, no problem at all. But mum or dad, the secondary relation certainly is not. So there's just complication everywhere we look. And we've found it as a business much easier to create our systems around having one homogeneous process dealing with different service offerings. So there are different service offerings, but the process that we use is the same. We have one carve out. And the one carve out where we do use the wholesale provisions is in the for purpose space. In this seminar, we're calling it not for profit. We call it for purpose. And we do find that when you're dealing with a committee, it's easier to get decisions made and keep things moving along using the wholesale provisions.
Paul, comments from you about sort of your model client and how you go about your high net worth clients, and as retail wholesale, how you treat them?
Sure. Well, we're very similar to David and his firm. We operate on the basis of asking the question, why wouldn't we? Under a basis and principles of fiduciary duty and best outcomes, why wouldn't we provide the highest standard that's found in the retail compliance and disclosure. I suppose on a more slightly more technical point, our MDA authorisation sits within our retail licence, and just for for absolute sure outcome, we think that all of those MDA services are best applied and operated through that MDA authorisation through the licence. When we set up the business 10 years ago, having sold the previous business to Perpetual, we found it difficult with ASIC to get any great clarity. And we thought the easier outcome is just to operate it under that retail MDA authorisation. Great.
Okay. So just with that, I'm just interested if you, for both of you, hi Simon, I'll come to you in a moment, Simon. I'm just interested in both of you that if you have a client that comes into your office, they've been referred to you by an accountant you might deal with who says, I'm a sophisticated client, I've got sign off to be a wholesale sophisticated client, that's the way I want to be looked after. What's the reaction, David and Paul, in your businesses if somebody says that to you?
Well, I suppose from our perspective at Cameron Harrison, that's an interesting fact or representation, but really for us, and I think it's pretty similar with David, whether the clients got 3 million of investable funds or whether they've got 10 million of investable funds, we're running a depth of advice outcome, of which investment management is one piece of that. But we're running investment management, with not in a vacuum, of just cutting up pieces of money and saying we'll manage that as a wholesale piece of money. It's got to have a lot deeper context to that. As medium to long-term managers, planning outcomes. We have a principle that we call mutual engagement. That is, we have to have a deep understanding of that client. That client has to have a deep understanding of us and what it is that we proffer. And to a certain extent, the fact that you might come with a sophisticated investor's certificate in an envelope, to a certain extent, is fairly relevant to us.
Okay. David?
Yeah, and for my part, Greg, that's never happened. I've never ever had that occur. Our approach is certainly, I think a lot of people approach this very, very similarly, but probably our most important meeting is the pre-discovery meeting. So by the time we've got through a pre-discovery meeting, which is a half-hour meeting on the phone or via Zoom, or it may be some of our younger advisors prefer to do it face-to-face, and for really much bigger clients, we might do it face-to-face. But we gather an enormous amount of information in that half an hour telephone call. It's incredible how generous people are with just background information. And what our antenna is tuned for in that half hour pre-discovery meeting is, do we actually want this person to be a client or not? I don't care how much money they've got, but are they going to be an ideal client for us? Because if they're not an ideal client for us, then that's really going to be highly problematic. And the type of language that you characterized of, this is who I am, and this is what I've got, and this is what I want you to do for me, almost would immediately neutralize that opportunity for us.
I'm going to come back
because it tells me that she wants to be in charge, and that's not how it is. Paul used the language of a mutual engagement. Wealthy people put their trousers on one leg at a time, just the same way I do every morning, right? So it doesn't then give them a right to be self-important.
Yeah, good. I'm going to come back. I want to flesh that out a bit more. But Simon, welcome along. Couple of questions for you, Simon. I think we sort of characterised a little bit at the start, but I hear a lot around the industry where I can move a whole lot of my high net worth clients to wholesale because I don't have to do that sort of onerous paperwork stuff. I'm not caught by the seven safe harbour steps of best interest duty. It's all sort of beer and skittles if I move all my clients to wholesale. As our legal expert on this call, what's your response to that?
Thanks, Greg, and hi to David and Paul and everyone watching in. I firstly apologise for missing the jump. It seems like Zoom didn't want me anywhere near this meeting this morning, so I had to find a hack my way in through the back door. As a lawyer, we're pretty used to not being wanted, but I was a bit upset that even Zoom's sort of figured it out as well, not to have too many lawyers around. Look, what we often speak to our clients being the wealth managers and financial advice firms is, look, if you are thinking about, well, transitioning your business into a wholesale only, or at least having a different sort of set of rules and advice infrastructure for wholesale clients, the principles should be largely the same, because the principles that underpin, the myriad of prescribed retail advice obligations, which frustrate advisors, and I understand why they frustrate advisors, but the principles that underpin them are sound. They're generally pretty good. Be honest, act in their best interest, prioritise their interest, disclose, be transparent, disclose the fees that you're charging, the services you're going to provide, and so on. What operating in a wholesale environment allows you to do is apply those principles with more flexibility. So you're not hemmed in, because in retail land you are hemmed in. There are an enormous number of documents, not only the documents themselves, the prescribed wording that's required to go into those documents, and the prescribed dates on which, before which those documents need to be provided on a regular basis. It may not necessarily work for you, and it probably may not even work for your clients in retail land. You've got no choice. In wholesale land, you do have a choice, and you can adapt the way that you deliver on those principles in a way that actually is more efficient and gives a better client experience. But just to your point about it being all beer and skittles, you're right, it's absolutely not. You still are required to have a license. You still you can't be misleading and deceptive. You still have to deliver your services efficiently, honestly, and fairly. There's no specific best interest duty in the sense of Section 961B of the Corporations Act, but under common law, you've got a fiduciary obligation anyway to act in your client's best interests and to prioritise their interest over yours in the event of a conflict. So ultimately, the way that you should be looking to advise the client should be more or less identical. The other thing to remember is, and it's true to say, of course, ASIC spends more of its time and resources regulating and enforcing compliance in the retail space. So some advice firms might say, oh, it's so much better if we operate only in wholesale land or predominantly in wholesale land, don't need to worry about ASIC. Well, yeah, but you may need to worry about your clients, because your clients can still claim against you and they can still take you to court. And in fact, if you're not operating in the best interests, acting in the best interests of your wholesale clients, who tend to be more sophisticated, they're the ones who actually probably have the means and the wherewithal to take you to court and hold you to account. So it's absolutely not beer and skittles. In many ways, the stakes aren't higher in the sense that it's more wholesale client is more important than a retail client. Every client's important, but the reason ASIC gets involved heavily in the retail sector is because they understand that a lot of retail clients don't have the time or the sophistication necessary to pick up on situations where the advisor may not be acting appropriately or may not be providing advice in their best interest. Most wholesale clients are probably more likely to do that. So I always say, look, same principles. It's not sort of the Wild West where you can do whatever you want. You've still got this fiduciary obligation. You've still got to act efficiently, honestly, and fairly. You can't mislead and deceive. It just allows you more flexibility to deliver the principles in a way that will help your client and your business.
Good. Thank you, Simon. I hope you weren't having a shot at David about the Wild West there just because he's from Perth. But the point that David made about client turning up, it could be that one person in a relationship or a business is sophisticated, but others around them are not. Does that sound like that's a sensible approach then to really think through that from your point of view, the way David and Paul sort of characterise that? Yeah,
so ultimately, the way we look at it, and we've kind of always had this view, I think now with the FASEA Code of Ethics, and whilst I understand that if an advisor is only authorised to provide advice to wholesale clients, they don't need to worry about the FASEA Code of Ethics. But I'll refer to it anyway. If an advisor can advise on retail and wholesale, then they are bound by the Code of Ethics. And the Code of Ethics gives us a couple of instances of pretty clear guidance about the fact that just because a specific client may pass one of the quantitative tests, all right, they're earning $250,000 gross income per year for the last 2 years, or they've got net assets of 2.5 million. Just because they've passed the quant test doesn't necessarily mean you should categorise them as wholesale. Because, and I think the guidance gives an example of a widower and her husband had handled the finances, and of course, property prices being what they are, she satisfied the 2.5 million. But in this case, the advisor realised she's not sophisticated. Yes, I could, strictly speaking, I could treat her as wholesale, but she's not. For all intents and purposes, she should be treated as a retail client, and the advisor chose to do so under the Corps Act. And this was the FASIA Code of Ethics, essentially saying that in that instance, the advisor did the right thing by choosing not to treat her as a wholesale client, even though he was technically permitted to do so under the Corps Act. So we've always been a big believer in applying, it's not one or the other, apply both, apply the quantitative test and then have a look at the qualitative. If the client passes the thresholds and is sophisticated enough and understands the difference between wholesale and retail, then you should feel free to go ahead and treat them as a wholesale client.
Good, thanks for that. Paul and David, I'd like to pick up on, you both sort of touched around my words. I don't know whether you exactly use the words of an ideal client, but there's a certain client type that you really like. And so I'd like to expand on that a little bit more, but also in conjunction because a lot of people, and David, you mentioned business owners. So a lot of people could come along to you and need advice, but they are either, a lot of their assets are in their business, a lot of their assets are in commercial property or other things that might be sort of, some advisors might see that outside their piece of sort of advice. But how do you incorporate, how do you think about that in a retail, now you deal with your clients in a retail sense? How do you bring that into your ideal client? So, David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's two parts to that. There's the psychology of the client that we get on best with. Are you happy for me to cover off on a bit of that?
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. And then there's also the complexity, the technical complexity. So we believe complexity comes in 3 types, and it's rare that there's not a combination of at least 2. So the first is genuine technical complexity, and that's all the property and stuff going on. The second is time complexity. So when you've got a busy business owner, we find this in particular with partners of law firms and that sort of thing. You have to have a particular, you can't use I'm stating the obvious, but you don't use the same advice style with your retired, mum and dad, where you're sitting down having a cup of tea, as you do with your busy, Collins Street law partner, because the decision making is fundamentally different. So you've got you've got technical complexity, you've got time complexity, and you've got emotional complexity. And I think a lot of people underestimate the time that's taken, particularly in intergenerational affairs, with emotional flexibility. I guess if I chunked it up, you'd be really looking at, is there goodwill in this relationship? Is this client genuinely looking for advice? Are they genuinely looking to us? As far as the psychology types that we like to deal with, we've done a lot of work around this. I don't really think there's been a huge amount of this done in Australia, but clients are motivated. This is well-established research. Clients are primarily motivated by one of 4 key drivers: achievement, freedom, security, or generosity. And those high-level drivers in our world, this is our research, are supported by 8 different personalities. So you've got the guardian, the family guardian, very much family oriented, very much wanting to do the right thing by their family, etc. So we bond very well with them. Builders, so SME owners, often they are also family guardians. So, but they tend to take a much longer term view. They invest in people. The feel in their business is just like the feel of their family at home. The people who work with and for them are seen as family members. Then there's the apprehensive. That will tend to be someone who is maybe an inheritor, or someone who has come into money because they've just had a divorce and they've never previously been the person who's had to look after the money. We do very, very good work with those sorts of people, because our intention is to take them on a journey so that they gain the confidence that they don't currently have today. And they really appreciate that. And then the fourth is the freedom seeker. And that's the person who says, look, I'm not really that interested in how my money is run. I want it to be done really professionally. I need and want someone I can trust. But at the end of the day, I've got a whole lot of other stuff in my life that I want to get on with. Then there's the other four behavioural profiles that we tend not to work quite so well with. The first one is the social spender. And it's very, very hard to not contain them, because we'd never really try to do that. But if, as everyone on the call will know, or the webinar will know, when you are working in a professional capacity, there's no point having a gym membership and not going to the gym. We actually, if people are paying for advice, we want them to stick to the program. The next is the controller. This is and they can also be in business, but they just want to control everything. It's their way or the highway. The maximizer, who is very frugal. They're very much achievement oriented, and their achievement is around how much money can I accumulate. So tend to be quite frugal. And then the final one is the maverick. And the maverick just is after everything shiny and new. It's lithium, then it's Bitcoin, then it's whatever. And we tend to work way better with the first four and not so well with the last four. So a lot of our conversation process is just trying to work out, okay, who's who in the zoo here? Can we work effectively with these people? And what's really interesting is that we've once you get that ideal client piece right, the actual retail versus wholesale thing falls away, because we just take them on a process. We seek to give them really, really good advice based on a very deep understanding of what it is they're looking for and their knowledge and capability. And I guess I'd say it doesn't seem to cause us a great deal of heartache.
Excellent. Thank you, David. That was really good. Paul, how do you go about that same sort of exercise with clients coming in and potentially asking for a whole lot of different things, but you have a model and you have a good way of giving advice?
Look, I suppose the key, it's a rule, is that before we will engage a client and a client engage us, they have to go through a 2 half-day planning session with us. A little bit like David, the significant amount of our clients are business owners or have been business owners. Having come from a chartered accounting, business advisory, tax background in terms of our people. We see our clients, particularly the business owners, there's 2 pools of wealth that we need to help them integrate. The first pool is their active wealth, which is active risk within their business. The second pool of wealth is their passive wealth, which is their lifestyle assets, their investment pool assets. And invariably, everyone has the goal to ultimately see that largely sit within their passive pool, so they can fund themselves beyond their business or professional service activities. So David touched on that complexity. We think of that planning process as a starting point in simplifying that complexity. And that's then what drives the agenda with that client. And that agenda will cover off really on 2 key aspects. The first is the structural agenda. That can be in terms of tax structuring, tax strategy, And the second part of the structure is asset protection, intergenerational wealth and estate planning. And then the second key part is the conduct. And we only get to the conduct part of, if you like, that's the investment management and the economic protection of that wealth, based on their particular objectives and risk parameters. And we only get to that after we've actually gone through those structural elements. And it's by doing that with them, that we set that wealth agenda in place. Again, David touched on time. Whether it's your individual life, whether it's as a business owner, there are only two key levers, time and capital. So and people's abilities to deal with their wealth agenda, we know through long experience, they can only focus on 3 to 4 critical things over a 8 to 12 month period. So planning for us is that initial plan, engagement, clear mission, clear vision, clear KPIs, particularly for us. But that's a reiterative process. So it's something that we will always be going back to them typically every 2 to 2.5 years in terms of that plan, but assessing then that wealth agenda with them on a rolling 6-month basis.
I like your term. I like your term of wealth agenda, Paul. I quite like the way that sort of sets out in my mind, anyway. And so, do you find that even for your larger, high net worth individuals and maybe even small family offices, that you end up looking after most of their wealth rather than just a proportion of their wealth?
We do. What we've tended to find, Greg, and there was that early discussion that we had in terms of particularly let's say that our family office clients who see themselves as wholesale investors, want to give you $250,000 or $500,000 to invest. That is of no interest to us. So to go to your question, yes, we see ourselves, and it's what we provide, is providing a strategic outcome for them. Now, it invariably doesn't mean we're managing the whole lot, but we are managing it to a determined piece of strategy. Practically, what we see is we tend to manage the financial assets, and in terms of their commercial and real property, they tend to handle that themselves. Now, that's the ideal relationship. Now, they'll have some, as is always the case, they'll have some satellite type positions and strategies that they're running, but we're very much there to provide the core ballast in terms of their financial wealth, but to a piece of higher level strategy, not just simply managing a piece of money.
Yeah, that's great.
Greg,
couple of questions coming. Sorry,
Greg, just an interesting point off the back of Paul's comments, and that is in this wealthier client space, you actually do spend quite a bit of time being an orchestra conductor. So we've spent a lot of time and effort building our professional network, whether it's binding financial agreements, it can be any sort of thing, more complex debt financing arrangements and the like. And they're obviously not things that we're giving advice on, but we're facilitating the outcome. So we're dealing with the complexity without actually having to put pen to paper.
Yeah, that's really good. It's a really good point. So a couple of questions coming in, but so I've got a bit of a double barrel one for you. One, we had a question about, do you think that the regulator might look at the wholesale rules and start to look at some of those? But in answering that, you might also cover off the fact that even if you want to go down, even if you use wholesale, there are some things you have to do retail, like structuring. There are some structuring things that you have to use. You can't get out of that, right? Do you want to comment about those couple of things?
Yeah, so advice about establishing an SMSF.
Exactly. Great. That's really the key example.
Yeah.
Right?
And technically also any advice then about consolidating into the SMSF or contributing.
Or winding one up and going to winding
one up. Yeah. Yeah. So that's always going to be caught as retail, which is difficult. There's some businesses just say we don't want to borrow that at all. Others say we'll have almost a ring-fenced little team of one or two retail advisors who can deal with that aspect of it. And some just say we'll just refer the client down the road to a trusted associate that runs a retail advice business, and then they'll just deal with the investment of the SMSF assets. But yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, that's the way it's always been. That advice in relation to a superannuation fund, which includes an SMSF, is going to be caught as retail. Just quickly too on this conversation, which has really been going for about 10 years about whether the thresholds are too low. I mean, I think most industry participants would probably agree. I mean, they're almost 20 years old now, the thresholds. I think they're just changing the thresholds would be a lazy solution. Realistically, it's not just the thresholds. It's just the rules are too complex. They're different according to whether you're a product provider or an advice provider. They're different depending on whether you're advising the client on their super or their non-super, or indeed general insurance. So I don't understand why. And you can absolutely have a situation where a product provider treats the client as retail, but a advice provider treats the client as wholesale, and vice versa. Now, that situation in of itself says that they've overly complicated this area, which doesn't need to be so complicated. I think you could just assess each client, and then that client themselves could be treated as wholesale everywhere they go, or retail everywhere they go. But yeah, certainly as part of that, they may also look at the thresholds. Given that I think that the 250,000 income probably is still reasonably valid. But I think that with property prices doing what they've done over the last 20 years, the net assets of 2.5 million probably caps a lot more Australians than was intended to. That's not my call to make, but my number one thing I'd do is simplify it. There's no reason for it to be as complicated as it is, and I don't think any benefit to anyone, to the client or to the industry participants.
Yeah, Paul and David, you both sort of made a comment along the lines of the fact that you made the decision to use retail, not wholesale. Partly was about the client and the experience you wanted to give, but it was partly you mentioned the word risk, and so what risks do you feel you've eliminated? And you're running your own licenses. I mean, you might want to comment about professional indemnity insurance or anything like that. But what was the sort of risk process you went through to make that decision?
Greg, I'll happily go first. We are seeking in our business. From a quality perspective. We're wanting our people to be able to provide the highest quality. To be able to do that, they need effective, continually improved systems and processes. So for us, it means that we have what we would view as one way, which is the best way, rather than the chopping and changing, between, that's retail, but let's say by designation or assessment, and that person's wholesale, and that therefore leaves it to differences in terms of how that wholesale client gets assessed. Things fall, can invariably fall between the cracks, and what you do is you just create this gulf. And for us, that just simply, in terms of having the advisors being able to do the best for their clients, that to us just looks like very bad business.
David?
I totally agree with Paul on that point. The idea of the best way, you have one process, and you're scaling up the client intimacy. The more the client's paying and the more there is, the more that needs to be done, and you scale back the client intimacy a bit, and it's a much more pragmatic service, but it's all retail. So you still have the scalability of it. I guess for us, I mentioned this in my opening comments. As soon as there's you've got a mum and a dad involved, one reasonably meets, but one clearly doesn't. You have an ethical obligation to call that out. And it's potentially even more dangerous because, prior to the code, one of the parties might not regularly come to meetings, yet you are advising them. Mm-hmm. So all of those things being put in writing, getting appropriate sign-offs of advice just made sense to us. From a risk perspective, the advice that we received, and it made sense to us, is that if you're treating someone as a wholesale client, say, and you're doing a rollout, we, for our sins, use Xplane. You're doing a rollout of an updated financial services guide, and it just happens that all of your wholesale clients get a financial services guide. They are now perfectly entitled to consider their retail clients. Similarly,
I see the lawyer nodding. So
yeah, similarly, if within your business someone says, okay, this advice for Mr. and Mrs. Jones is ready, great, let's send it out, and they just happened to have used statement of advice, that's now a retail client. And that's really not a risk I want to have to deal with. There's enough risk in our business at the moment, transaction risks and those sorts of things if your advice is sound, pragmatic, I do think that AFSL holders, owners like us have a little bit more flexibility around the way we design, produce and deliver our statements of advice. I still see, the institutionally owned statement of advice that's very, very heavy document. I think that's a very, very hard thing to have to deal with for clients.
Yeah. Couple of questions through there. One, I'm hoping the person who put the question up about not-for-profits, and David and Paul mentioned not-for-profits. I'm hoping you're dialing back in for Wednesday when we're covering not-for-profits, because I might pick that question up for that because of time today. But Simon, there was a question in there about, does that mean under a license you could actually grant an authorization to an advisor to deal with wholesale clients only, and they wouldn't have to meet the FASIA tests and do the exam and all those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, the Code of Ethics and most of the FASIA rules actually apply to relevant providers, and a relevant provider is defined as an advisor who is authorised by their licensee to provide personal advice to retail clients. So even if you only provide advice to wholesale clients, that's kind of irrelevant. It's what your authority says. So if your authorization says. So if your authorization says you can provide advice to retail and wholesale, then you're caught by FASIA. If you deliberately limit, or your licensee deliberately limits your authorization to wholesale, then you exist outside the FASIA universe.
Right. I don't know what the rest of you on the webinar think, but in trying to be a profession and making sure we're professional, having the right ethics, it's okay to be authorised as wholesale, but the reason to step outside doesn't sort of sit well with me. I don't know what you think. Any comments?
Big question there, Greg. Ethics and teaching ethics. I don't know. A certain, Jeff Skilling was ex-managing director of Enron. Got distinction at Harvard for his ethics exam. Where did that get him? I think it's a huge minefield.
So I wasn't trying to ascertain the person that asked the question was going down that line, but I just think,
No. I think our starting point with all of this is what's the best thing that we can possibly do for our clients, and when you get out of bed every day and you really set about doing the right thing by people. Now, I saw a comment in the chat about the Mayfair 101. if they were trying to do the right thing by people right from the get-go, that's a really, really interesting way to show it. But if that's our starting point, we really want to do the right thing by people, then that just flows through everything you do. You know, you have a transaction error, you don't cover it up, you fix it, you cough up the money, you make sure a complaint never arises. When it comes to your advice process, well, if I were a client here, what would my expectations be? And you just don't cut corners. You do whatever you have to do. And frankly, you have to charge fees commensurate with the delivery of that service.
David, you know, one of the things that this is more at the corporate level, but it goes to this thing about standards and responsibility. One of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley did in the US in terms of corporate responsibility is it saw sign off by the managing director and the finance director of those accounts. And it forced people to acknowledge their responsibility on a continuing basis. And to us, that seems to be fairly much at the core of what's missing. And if advisors and advisory firms had to sign off on those standards of declaration, I think we, in the interest of simplicity and effective outcomes, we might see, something that has been effective in terms of Sarbanes-Oxley and forcing individuals providing advice to be accountable to those standards. But maybe
thank you, Paul. Well, Paul, Simon, and David, thank you very much for your time today. I found it really enlightening to hear both Paul and David how you operate your firms. Simon, sort of your legal input to that. So I think it was a really, really good session. I hope everybody on the webinar gained something out of it and learned more about how they put things in place in their own practice around high net worth and potentially wholesale clients. So Toby, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Greg. If you just put yours on mute, that would be great. So look, I'd like to reiterate Greg's thanks to Simon, David and Paul. Each of them has talked around this very important topic of wholesale clients with the insight that comes from being actively involved in it. On Wednesday, 2 days' time, as Greg mentioned, we'll be having a similar webinar which focuses on not-for-profits and charities and how they can become part of an advice business and the really quite specific and particular requirements to serve them. And then on Friday, we'll be drawing the threads together with John Woodley from Fitzpatrick's, John Barton from MGD Private, to talk about the strategic issues of thinking about these types of clients. So let me just remind you of our upcoming Advisor Roadshow in May, where we'll actually be picking up on a number of the issues that our panelists today have talked about, and we would look forward to you joining us then. So Greg, Paul, Simon, David, thanks very much for today. It's been a pleasure and very interesting, and we look forward to those of you in the audience joining us again on Wednesday to look at not-for-profits and charities. Thanks very much.